You have seen this image 1,000 times. On phone cases, on tote bags, on coffee mugs hanging in kitchens all over the world. A giant blue wave curling over 3 tiny boats, with Mount Fuji sitting quietly in the distance. It is one of the most reproduced pieces of art in human history. But look closer at the top of that wave. Those white shapes aren't just drops of foam. They curl into long, reaching fingers, like a hand about to close around the men below. Vincent van Gogh saw it and wrote that the waves were claws, and the boat was caught in them. Hokusai didn't carve a pretty seascape. He carved something that has been quietly unsettling people for almost 200 years, and most of them never figure out why. So let's actually look at it. Not the version on the tote bag. The real one. The print is called Under the Wave off Kanagawa, though almost everyone just calls it the Great Wave. Katsushika Hokusai made it around 1831 in the city then known as Edo, the place we now call Tokyo. And the scene is not some mythical ocean from a legend. It is a specific stretch of water off the coast of Kanagawa, near what is today the city of Yokohama. Those 3 boats are not pleasure cruisers. They are fast cargo boats called Oshiakuribune, the delivery trucks of their day, built to rush fresh fish from the open water back to the hungry markets of Edo. Each one is packed with rowers, bent low over their oars, racing the tide. Look at the whole picture, and you can count around 24 men clinging to those narrow wooden hulls. And the wave hanging above them? For almost 100 years, people called it a tsunami. It is not. Historians and even ocean scientists who have studied the print agree that Hokusai almost certainly never witnessed a tsunami, and the wave he drew behaves like something else entirely. A rogue wave. A freak wall of open water thrown up by wind and current, the kind that appears out of nowhere and can swallow a ship whole. Based on the size of those fishing boats, researchers have estimated the wave rises somewhere between 10 and 12 meters. That is a moving cliff of water, about as tall as a 3-story building, frozen in the air right above their heads. That is the literal picture. A handful of working men, in 3 small boats, in the exact wrong place at the exact wrong moment. But to understand what Hokusai really buried in this image, you first have to understand the strange old man who made it. By the time he carved the design for the Great Wave, Hokusai was already in his early 70s, and he had been chasing this exact image for most of his life. Back in the late 1700s, he made his first rough attempts at a big wave crashing over boats. They were stiff and flat, almost clumsy. He tried again in his 40s and got closer, but it still wasn't right. He kept circling the same idea across nearly 40 years, like a man trying to remember a dream he couldn't quite see. Hokusai himself once said that nothing he made before the age of 70 was really worth anything. Coming from the artist behind the most famous wave on Earth, that is a wild thing to admit. And here is a detail that surprises almost everyone. The Great Wave is not a painting. Hokusai never touched a single copy with a brush. What you are looking at is a woodblock print. Hokusai drew the design, and then master craftsmen, carvers who had trained for years, cut that design into blocks of cherry wood, a separate block for each color. Printers then inked those blocks and pressed them onto paper, one careful layer at a time. The image you know was a team effort, and Hokusai is simply the only name that survived. It was also cheap. This was not a treasure locked away in a palace. Thousands of copies were pulled and sold to ordinary people on the streets of Edo for roughly the price of a bowl of noodles. The most reproduced artwork in human history started out as the equivalent of a cheap poster. But what made those early copies leap off the paper was the color. That deep, almost electric blue in the wave came from a brand new pigment called Prussian blue, freshly imported into Japan from Europe. Japanese viewers had simply never seen a blue like it before. It glowed. And that detail matters far more than it sounds, because that foreign blue is the very first clue that this image is secretly about the outside world pressing in. Hold on to that thought. Now go back to the top of the wave. The part from the opening. The part nobody really stops to look at. And before you do, here is something the original audience experienced that we completely miss today. Japanese is traditionally read from right to left, so the first viewers of this print would have started on the right, with the small boats and the straining fishermen, and only then swept their eyes left and up into that towering wall of water rearing back to crash down on them. They did not ride along with the wave. They came face to face with it as it reached for the men. And look at what it is reaching with. Hokusai did something here that is genuinely unsettling once you notice it. The white foam at the crest does not splash like normal foam. It fractures. It breaks into smaller and smaller curling shapes, little hooks and tendrils that hang down toward the boats like fingers. Some people look at it and see falling snow, but the longer you stare, the more it looks like something with intent. A claw, a pale hand made of seawater, opening up directly above the men below. You are not imagining it, and you are not the first. In the autumn of 1888, in a small yellow house in the south of France, Vincent van Gogh was haunted by this exact detail. He had seen the print months earlier in Paris, and he could not shake it. He sat down and wrote to his brother Theo, describing Hokusai's waves as claws, saying the boat was caught in them and that you could feel it. This is one of the greatest painters who ever lived, and his takeaway from the great wave was not peace, and it was not beauty. It was the feeling of being grabbed. That is the first secret. The wave is not just water. Hokusai drew it as something alive, something hunting. If this is rewiring the way you see an image you've looked at your whole life, do me a quick favor and hit subscribe. This channel goes deep on the hidden stories inside famous art every single week. Now the claw is only the surface, because there is something else hidden inside the actual shape of that wave. Trace the outline of the great wave slowly with your eyes. Start at the wide base on the right, follow it as it arcs high up to the left, and watch how the crest splits and curls back down toward the water. There is a Japanese character that looks almost exactly like that shape. It is pronounced dai, and it means, of all things, great or big. The character is built from a simple, striking form. It looks like a person standing with their legs apart and their arms thrown wide open. One long, sweeping stroke across the top, two more strokes spreading out below. Lay that shape over the silhouette of the wave, and the resemblance is hard to unsee. The towering arc across the top, the reaching arms of foam, the wide, planted stance at the base. Now, an honest word here, because this is the spot where the internet usually lies to you. No museum has confirmed that Hokusai planted that character on purpose, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. It may simply be a coincidence. But Hokusai was a man who loved visual puns, hidden jokes, and double meanings. He buried sly little gags and tiny details throughout his work for 60 years. So the idea that the master of the great wave shaped his masterpiece to quietly echo the word for great is not some wild stretch. It is exactly the kind of thing he loved to do. And once you see it, that connection lives in your head forever. So we have a wave drawn like a claw, shaped like the word for great. A gorgeous image that keeps whispering about size and threat and reaching hands. To understand why, you need to know what Japan actually was in the year 1831. For more than 200 years, Japan had been a sealed country. Under the rule of the Tokugawa shoguns, the borders were locked. Foreigners were almost entirely banned from entering. Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving under threat of death. An entire civilization closed off from the rest of the planet for generation after generation. And in that world, the ocean meant something very specific. The sea was not a road. It was a wall. A vast protective moat that kept the rest of the world at arm's length. For centuries, waves in Japanese art could stand for exactly that defense, the barrier that kept Japan safe and separate from everything beyond the horizon. Which is what makes the Great Wave so quietly radical. Look again at what Hokusai actually drew. The boats are not safe behind the sea. They are out in it. Exposed, tiny, surrounded on every side. The art historian Christine Guth, one of the leading scholars on this print, points out that the old meaning has flipped completely. In Hokusai's image, the sea is no longer a wall keeping the world out. It has become the dangerous open medium that Japan must now venture into, with no guarantee of ever coming back. And remember that foreign Prussian blue, glowing in the water. Remember the Western sense of perspective and depth that Hokusai borrowed to build the scene. The outside world had already seeped into the very materials of the image itself. Hokusai was making this print only a couple of decades before American warships would finally force Japan's doors open for good. He did not live to see that moment. But standing right at the end of a closed era, an old artist drew his country as a few small boats, dwarfed by an enormous force rising up out of the sea, with claws. Read it that way. and it stops being a postcard. It starts to feel like a premonition. But here is what saves this image from being pure doom, and it may be the detail Hokusai cared about most. Look at the men in the boats one more time. They are not screaming. They are not throwing up their arms in panic. They are low, locked in, rowing straight into the heart of the wave, calm and disciplined. If the wave is the threat, then those fishermen are the answer to it. Endurance, in human form. And then there is Mount Fuji, shrunk down, far in the distance, sitting perfectly still beneath all that chaos. To the Japanese, Fuji was sacred, eternal, the unshakable soul of the country itself. Hokusai places it right at the center of the storm, completely untouched. The wave rages, the men strain, but the mountain simply remains. So the full message of the print was never just fear. It is a balance. Overwhelming danger above, fragile human grit in the middle, and something eternal and unmoving underneath it all. A nation bracing for a wave it could not stop and refusing to let go of the oars. Hokusai died in 1849, still convinced he was only just beginning to understand how to draw. He never knew what his wave would become. Within a few decades, Japan's long isolation finally collapsed and the doors swung open, and when they did, the great force did not come crashing in. It rushed out. Japanese prints flooded into Europe, and the great wave landed in the middle of the Western art world like a depth charge. It got into Van Gogh, whose swirling night skies owe a clear debt to that curling crest. It got into Claude Monet, who covered the walls of his home in Giverny with Japanese prints. It even got into music. The composer Claude Debussy was so taken with the image that the wave appeared on the cover of his orchestral work La Mer, meaning the sea. The image just kept traveling, onto banknotes and museum walls, onto the emoji keyboard on the phone in your pocket right now, onto millions of those tote bags and coffee mugs we started with. A print once sold for the price of noodles has since sold at auction for almost $3 million. And then comes the part that feels almost too strange to be true. In 1896, and again after the devastating tsunami that struck northern Japan in 2011, people all over the world reached for one single image to make sense of the horror. They reached for Hokusai's wave. A print that was probably never meant to show a tsunami at all became the face of real ones. The quiet warning an old man buried in a cheap woodblock print. A tiny country swallowed by an unstoppable wall of water somehow outlived him by nearly 200 years and kept coming true in ways he could never have imagined. So the next time you see it, on a wall, on a screen, on a stranger's phone case, look at the top of the wave. Find the claws. Trace the shape of the word for great. Picture a sealed country staring down a force it could not hold back. You will never see it as just a pretty blue wave again.